Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, Fauci, central bank digital currencies, transhumanism, all this stuff. And you still think we're crazy? Check out some of these clips I have in this video. Please excuse the audio not lining up completely with some of the video. I don't know what happened there, but take it for the value of content.
How the world should look like, which we want to come out of this transformation period. I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years. I think it's a role model for many countries.
He's not attending Davos this year. Do you have a message for him?
I had already a message for him when I invited him. I said Davos is the right place to present a comprehensive plan how to get out of the present situation. Probably the time is not yet ripe. At least he has sent a very powerful delegation here. And I hope that we can contribute with some bridge-building activities which we have to prepare that Russia comes back into the European house.
Сталкиваемся, будь то проблемы климата и экологии, проблемы экономического роста могут быть решены только путем сотрудничества на глобальном уровне. Меня называют отцом четвертой промышленной революции. Я написал об этом книгу. Хочу вам ее подарить.
Now, if there's one thing, and it might be the only thing up for debate that I think financial sector participants agree on at this moment is whether you're bank, regulator, consumer, business, is that the current system can be more efficient. It can be more inclusive and it can be fairer. The big question is, how do we achieve that? And there are many ways of going about it. What if I told you 90% now of the world's central banks say they're investigating central bank digital coins, whether pushed by the private sector, and I see some faces that I recognize in the audience, or working with the private sector, let's be clear. I think we all recognize that technology like central bank digital coins have the potential to reshape the financial system. The question is, what do we need to know? What are the macroeconomic, the geopolitical consequences? What are the benefits, but also the challenges of rollout? Data privacy, security, scalability, just to name a few. At the heart of any currency, how do we ensure trust, particularly given the great turbulence we see across financial markets, but specifically in private crypto markets today, and how new this concept is? We have to get it right first time. It has to be a benefit to users, but also minimize financial security and financial stability risks. Kristalina, I'll begin with you.
Well, when somebody promises you 20% return on something that is not backed by any assets, how would we normally call this thing? We would call it a pyramid. In other words, this is a pyramid in the digital age. But we should not be mistaken to immediately classify everything in the digital money world in a negative way, because there are three categories. The first one is central bank digital currencies. They are backed by the state, and they offer finality when transactions are settled. This is a universe that, as you said, 90% of countries are exploring. Who crossed the finish line first? The Bahamas with the sand dollar. But now we have Nigeria stepping there, and there are many pilots, of which the largest universe of a pilot, which actually made me wake up and say, well, this thing is moving so fast that the International Monetary Fund has to embrace it. China with a pilot with 128 million participants. Now, the second group, these are the stable coins. Some of them deserve the name because they are backed by assets and when they're backed by assets 1-to-1, they're really stable. They look a little bit like money market funds, but they're money market funds in this digital space. And then we have lower degree of stability. The less there is a backing, the more you should be prepared to take the risk of this thing blowing in your face, which is what happened some days ago.
I think it's the way I look at it is, what do we try to fix? What do we try to address? And when you go back, and you said it roughly some 10 years ago or 8 years ago here at the WEF, it was blockchain and that will revolutionize and banks are gone and everything will be completely different. We are still here, fortunately, so glad that I can sit here on that chair.
Governments were
so
coming
you
down
had
when
then
I first
obviously,
got
as
involved.
Kristalina clearly said, cryptocurrencies, crypto assets, that's one thing. Then the stable or not so stable coins in the middle. And now we talk about central bank digital currencies. Or central banks strongly feel, at least in certain jurisdictions, there's a certain need that needs to be addressed. And I think we didn't talk about yet, there are two ways on central bank digital currencies. One is the wholesale piece. So basically, our interactions as a commercial bank with the central bank. And here, I would say it makes a lot of sense. This is new technology coming in. We can talk about it, advantage, disadvantage, but at the end, it's an efficiency game, and maybe it's a security game, makes a lot of sense. A completely different ball game it is when you start to talk about the retail central bank digital currency, not because it's digital. I can pay this digital with my mobile, has nothing to do with central bank digital currency. But I think the fundamental change is the underlying business model is as a retail customer, as a citizen, will have an account with the central bank. I don't have just an account with a commercial bank. I have it with the central bank, which has a lot of advantages for me. It's safe, it feels good. But there are some challenges with this, because the central bank is ultimately, it's a public office. Commercial banks are under a commercial regime. Central banks are not under a commercial regime. What about interest rates on an account like that? When things are going well, how does this look like? Oh, on a bank run, how does this look like? Is this accelerating the bank run because I have a safe account with somebody? So these are then the fundamental questions.
Hello from the World Economic Forum in Geneva. My name is Adrian Monk. Delighted to welcome you to this launch briefing for a new book from the Forum, COVID-19, The Great Reset. I'm joined here in our studios in Geneva by the authors, Thierry Malloret, a former Forum colleague, and by Professor Klaus Schwab, who is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, and also by my colleague Sadia Zahidi, who leads the economic and societal work here in Geneva.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Adrian. Let's first look at the impact COVID-19 probably has. We don't know yet the final outcome of this pandemic. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but we know already that it will have a changing effect, changing on economies, societies. It's not just to be compared with the economic crisis which we had to pass through 10 years ago. The effect will be much similar to World War, and actually all countries in the world are affected. So if we look at the impact, of course, we first see the impact on global economic growth. Even in the most optimistic estimates of the IMF and OECD, we will be back to the output level of the end of 19 only in the best case, only at the end of 21. So look at the debt which we are loading on our shoulders. The world was already indebted at an amount of over 300% of GDP. Now, the rescue programs of the governments represent another $10 trillion, which will be added to our debt load and will have to be, in some way, be repaid by future generations. I'm also, of course, looking at the unemployment, which and the impact on livelihoods. We know many people, according to the ILO, about 50% of people in the world will be affected, combined, taking the combined effects of COVID-19 and the fourth industrial revolution. And finally, not to forget the figures. I mean, we look at the statistics, we see more than 500,000 people who have died. Just imagine the personal tragedy which is behind all those cases. So we have to be very careful not just to look at the figures. Now, when we look at COVID, I think we should distinguish between three phases. We have the three R's: restrain, which means to fight the virus, the hot phase. Most countries are in today. Then we have recover, to go back to a kind of new normal. And finally, the reset, which means to define and to design the strategies which should lead us in the after-corona phase. What kind of world do we want to build? What do we know? What did we learn? It cannot be governments alone. It cannot be business alone. If you look at the issue of environment, even if you look at the issue of creation of vaccines or remedies and so on, it's always a cooperation between governments, business, and I think it has to be supported by the great public, by civil society. For us, very important is to have a forward-looking voice, because if you take the median age of the global population, which is below 30 years old, here we talk about long-term perspectives, and we have to engage the young generation. And also, not only the enthusiasm and the support, but also the ideas of the young generation.
I want to start with Bill Gates. Your new book is titled How to Prevent the Next Pandemic, but this panel is about preparing for the next pandemic. So is the next pandemic really preventable?
Well, the ideal is that when you have outbreaks, that you detect them early and you contain them before they go global. Well, there certainly was time enough for some countries to respond and have, very, very mild pandemics. Ground zero, wherever the emergence takes place, is always going to have the toughest job. Will they see an elevation in respiratory symptoms? Will they see an elevation in deaths? Will they run a diagnostic panel? They're not going to be sequencing everything. But when you get an elevation, or you get your normal diagnostic panel showing something unusual, then you've got to start sequencing. And, so there could be more delay in reaction if we have a country with low capacity and we don't have a global team. People always talk about, let's help countries do better. Yeah, we should help countries do better. But a lot of the pandemic risks are in countries who in the next several decades will not have that local capacity. So you have to have global capacity. If you're serious about pandemics, you have to have global capacity that can come in and do those things. So we see that a lot. But here we're lucky. If this had been 10 years ago, some of these vaccine technologies did not exist. If it comes 10 years from now, we should have far, far better diagnostic technology. That is, be able to scale up every country within a month to diagnose their entire population. We should have much better therapeutics, some of which will be pathogen independent. And then, as we do come up with vaccines, we want vaccines that are infection blocking and long duration, which today, the vaccines have saved millions of lives, but they don't have much in the way of duration, and they're not good at infection blocking.